I've given him his introduction already. Let's welcome back to the programme our great friend and colleague, the one and only Tony Gosling. Your thoughts on emerging stories this afternoon. The Russian state, or elements of the Russian state, being blamed for supplying the Labour Party with that document about the US-UK trade talks last year, but also being accused by Canada, the UK and the US of trying to steal COVID vaccine research material. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there must be somewhere at the BBC or MI5 somebody sitting there constantly looking to try and make up stories about how terrible Russia is. I mean, there really is an attempt to demonise Russia, because Russia is a confident, independent nation that tells things as it is and acts in the Middle East, to protect its own interests. Quite an independent. I'm a big fan of Putin, actually. I've got no bones about saying that. A lot of people are scared to. In fact, I was chatting to someone the other day, a quite wealthy, well-connected person, that says, I'm just frightened to mention how much I support Putin, because his voice is constantly puncturing the nonsense that we're getting from the Western media. And I honestly think that in the West, our media is becoming more and more like what used to be called CCTV, the Chinese state media, all the time. It's becoming boring. For example, last night on Channel 4 News, we had a whole long section about this statue that's been put up instead of Edward Colston's in Bristol, which was just boring. It was egotistical. The artist involved, I think, is a complete nobody. He just copies Damien Hirst, and, there's an attempt here just to it's a publicity stunt. And Channel 4 News carry a, 5-10 minute piece all about it, as if they didn't realise it's a publicity stunt. So we're becoming rather dull, like China. And so that's why we're getting so much anti-Russia stuff.
Well, hang on a second now. A broken clock is right twice a day. If you're Vladimir Putin or his agents, you look last year, you think, who's the best bet for me? Maybe Jeremy Corbyn is my best bet. Maybe if Jeremy Corbyn leads the next government, there'll be a reversal of the UK's serious strategy. It makes perfect sense to me, and I wouldn't hold it against Putin either if they were making research materials available, or even documents pertaining to the UK-US trade and the possibility that the NHS might be at risk. Why wouldn't Putin do it? Why can't we countenance that fact? Surely, as I said, a broken clock is right twice a day, Tony.
Yeah, look, it's quite feasible. In fact, it might even be possible that Russian media did a bit of an investigation into this and published it themselves, but the British media didn't pick up on it. Look, the only people who've been trying to undermine Corbyn is not, or even in this case, big up Corbyn. It's the British themselves. There's been a massive infiltration of the Labour Party last year, as we now know, where there was a whole bunch of people working full-time apparatchiks for Labour who were actively working to stop Corbyn being elected. Now that, to me, is the problem. We are allowing our own democracy to be undermined, and the idea that somebody has got some stories from Russia. The Russian intelligence is blamed for any information that comes out that the Western oligarchy don't like. And every single time this happens, they point the finger at Russia. By the way, the whole Skripal thing, my latest take on that is that Skripal, so there was an independent article about a week after it all happened, which I think is one of the most important articles of the lot, which it explains that Skripal wanted to go back to Russia. And so he, by the way, intimately knew this Christopher Steele guy, ex-MI6, and was involved apparently in the preparation of the Steele dossier, which was used in order to smear Donald Trump. Now, just imagine if Skripal had been allowed to go back to Russia and been on RT, strolled into their Moscow TV studio and started talking about how MI6 had fabricated all this evidence against Donald Trump in order to try and fix the US elections. MI6 would have ended up with a bit of egg on their face. So I think this is the reason why we had the whole Skripal incident. I mean, that's at least my latest educated guesswork, is in order to protect MI6's backside. And imagine if Skripal had been on the telly talking about all this sort of thing, it would have been an absolute sensation. The Brits would have ended up with egg all over their face. So I think it's MI6 did basically what on earth are we going to do in order to pin Skripal down and keep him here in the UK? So that's my take on it. So there's all sorts of attempts to smear Russia. I mean, it's not the first time. Hitler tried to do it. He tried to invade. He tried to destroy Moscow and Russia. Napoleon has tried it over the years. And this is really just a basic hatred of the old-fashioned way of doing things, the honest old-fashioned Christian way, which is the Orthodox Church. The Catholics didn't like it, the Protestants didn't like it, and they're just gunning for Moscow because it's an actual bastion of the Orthodox Church and honesty. So that's my take on all of this.
Yeah, it's very plausible, Tony. It is very plausible. I also think that there is a danger when we like the Russian government's approach to foreign policy, when we appreciate the Russian government's support of Syria, which is vital. There's also a danger that we do forget that you said you like Putin. I know enough about Vladimir Putin from my time in media to know that Putin is a gangster. I could spend...
They all are.
Of course, and I could spend an hour here talking about the Sochi Olympics and money going missing in the billions, well, in the tens of millions, let me say that. Look, all of these states are doing things in their own interests, and it's a bit silly for anybody, I think, and I'm not suggesting you're silly, but it's a bit short-sighted for anybody to imagine that any one state is completely pure in its intentions and in its actions.
They're definitely not pure, right?
No, right, they're not.
Let's look at how Putin came to power. In the early 1990s, he was going on skiing holidays with Boris Berezovsky, who was the number one top oligarch. And who knows what was happening in those little chalets. I won't say any more than that. But anyway, he got very, very closely into, he was working for the KGB, of course, and he was very closely into Berezovsky's confidence. Then Berezovsky was the most powerful because, number one reason is because he started NTV, which was the first Russian independent television channel, and they were dishing the dirt on Yeltsin and all sorts of people during the 1990s. When it came to 2000, the Yeltsin, basically the whole thing had fallen apart. Most of Russia, I mean, I'm talking about credibility of the Russian government, and most of Russia had then been bought up for pennies by, the nationalised industries had all been sold for pennies by these oligarchs. And it was time for Berezovsky thought, I want somebody a bit more credible who's going to be my little poodle in charge. The only trouble was when Putin did turn up in the Kremlin, he immediately turned the tables on Berezovsky and asked the chief prosecutor, have you got anything on this guy, And it turned out, of course, they did. They had loads of charges against Berezovsky that Yeltsin had quashed. And so the most powerful and important case was one of the privatisation of Aeroflot, the corruption involved in that, and loads of dodgy money coming from Switzerland to do that. And so he said, OK, let's get that case going. And then a few months later, old Berezovsky gets a call from Putin saying, look, I'm really sorry, but the police, I couldn't stop them. They're coming in the morning, and you better get out of the country tonight. And so, of course, Berezovsky then flew to London, and that was the end of the chief oligarch. And Putin made sure that the other oligarchs were only going to stay in Russia if they agreed not to try and take over the Kremlin or interfere with national politics. So he is, of course, a gangster like the other oligarchs are, but he's very definitely number one in Russia.
Yeah, and Russia isn't a threat to peace and stability on the international stage, and that's all that really matters to me. Putin is a problem for the Russian people. I can believe that people inside Russia would have preferred Corbyn, believing that Corbyn's approach to Syria would be different. I can understand that. What I can't believe is the add-on story today that Russia has been hacking into the UK, US and Canadian and other countries' research into the COVID vaccine. Or if I'm told that I must believe that, well, I'm also going to believe then that every single country in the world is doing it. I think that's a pathetic story this afternoon. And I don't think we need to spend too much time.
We need to have evidence with these stories. You can't just take this on trust from the BBC. Are you having a laugh?
Yeah. Well, it's worse than that. It's a case of occasionally a reporter will ask an intelligence expert for, at least some evidence. And the stock answer, of course, is it will compromise an ongoing investigation or an ongoing mission. And that's nonsense, and they take it as given. We won't stay with that. We will talk about masks, but I want to talk about this Bristol statue. Just, I know you touched on it a second ago, this artist who's been called a narcissist, and this woman, Jen, Reed, this woman who stood on the empty plinth when the Colston statue was thrown away. They're talking black power and stuff. What do you make of some of our mutual acquaintances, people we would have rubbed up against over the years, you and me, are very concerned about the Black Lives Matter. Not what it began as, the grassroots movement it did begin that was genuinely concerned about black people being disproportionately targeted by the police, not just in America but elsewhere. But that it's growing into something different, Tony, with enormous funding coming in now for some of the biggest companies in the world. Should we be concerned about that?
Well, of course we should. Look, Black Lives Matter, as far as I can see, and of course I've got no real inside information, you just need to look at the circumstantial evidence and the financial evidence. It looks to me as if this is an attempt to have a kind of colour revolution style movement that can be fairly easily manipulated in Britain. But look, one thing I found out about the funding of it, I mean, most people realise that there's a lot of Soros money has gone into this over the years. But there's this thing called the Democracy Alliance in the US, which is headed up by a woman called Leah Hunt Hendricks, a white girl, and she's very pro Black Lives Matter. She's been making sure that a lot of Democracy Alliance money goes to them. And the interesting thing about her is that her granddad was one of the main funders of the Ku Klux Klan, a guy called H.R. Hunt, and he was also one of the people involved in the Kennedy assassination. The night before, they all went round to one of the houses, I think it was Clint Murchison's house, and this is all evidence from Lyndon Johnson's girlfriend. And these whole lot got together to finalise the plans to kill Kennedy and to sign it all off and to give it the go-ahead. And so her grandfather, of the woman who is now funding Black Lives Matter through Democracy Alliance, this Leah Hunt Hendricks, was involved in funding the Ku Klux Klan and chopping off the head of President Kennedy. Oh, and by the way, funding the Nation of Islam too. So these people's game is pretty clear to me, Richie, which is they fund both sides of the chessboard. They want civil society movements on both sides. And, I have no real problems with the actual ordinary grassroots people in Black Lives Matter. But what bothers me is that the people that dish out the funding often get a great deal they get to choose who runs the organisation at the higher level. And this particular statue in Bristol of Jen, well, I've got not real problem with that, but you just look at the guy that's the artist behind it. I mean, unbelievable. This bloke, Mark Quinn, he's a satanic artist, I would say. He's obsessed with blood. You know, what is this? He's the only artist to really go to town on every few months. He's been taking blood out of his body, and then collecting it all up and then freezing it and then making images of himself using this 10 pints of his own blood to make a kind of head of himself mixed with plaster of Paris and blood. Every 5 years he does it. Once isn't good enough for this guy. He's also obsessed, by the way, with making artistic images, if you can call them artistic. I would say they're monstrosities that should just be smashed up and destroyed and thrown in the garbage heap, of deformed people. So people who've been genetically mutated and deformed in the womb, people who've had hideous accidents, and people who've been smashed up or deformed due to war or illness. So this is Mark Quinn for you. And this is the guy they have all over Channel 4 News giving him a whole load of free publicity. What a great guy he is. So his net worth will have gone up. And it's just a publicity stunt, like I said before. But what a horrible guy. You know, I don't think that this is art at all. Art should be about crystallizing something beautiful in a permanent form. Now that obviously isn't the slave trader, right? Of course it's not. But let's not have people making artistic copies of themselves using their own blood, having dripped it out of their body for 5 years or something, and then trying to make out that's great art. No, it's just ego.
So you would censor Quinn then? I mean, I don't like it either.
Look, if I was a curator, I would throw him in the dustbin, basically.
I don't like it either now.
I wouldn't even put it in front of the public. I think it's really nasty, negative stuff. If you go past that, you say on your way to the shops, it would turn your stomach. It wouldn't give you any kind of artistic benefit. It's not filling you with the joy of life. It's doing the total opposite. It's actually a psychological attack on everyone that goes past it.
You know, listen, I had to read that stuff twice to realise it was true, in case my listeners are wondering why I'm not challenging you on your characterisation of the man's work. What Tony has said is true, and I've seen some of these images online, and I find them pretty awful too. But I mean, if one person likes it, well, it's art, isn't it? I suppose. But look, I hear you loud and clear. The information you just gave me about E. Howard Hunt's granddaughter, I didn't know that, so that's new information for me. I mean, she's got to have some intelligence background then. That's absolutely gobsmacking stuff, that. You know, she's heading up these organisations in America.
Yeah,
now.
I mean, what we've seen, I mean, starting, I think, probably in the former Yugoslavia, but been rolling out in places like Ukraine, attempts to do it in Syria and failing in Libya, places like this, and Tunisia, is these colour revolutions. The OPPOR is one of the organisations involved in doing these, and they basically have similar kinds of campaigns in different countries in order to create massive civil society movements that are out on the streets. Well, in Ukraine, that led to the murdering of a whole load of police and demonstrators by snipers employed by NATO countries, NATO intelligence services, and it's actually, I believe it's the Georgian snipers that went and confessed to being involved in it. There is quite a bit out there now about who was actually shooting people in Ukraine. So the idea is you create this massive sort of street demonstration movement, then you kill a whole bunch of police and demonstrators, and then you got a coup. You know, so there's an enormous panic in the government. What the hell are we going to do about this? And that's when the troops move in and say, okay, it's time to take over now. You've lost control of the country. So that's the way OPPOR effectively operates. And that seems to me as if in the US and Britain that's there's an attempt to get something like that started here. But of course, this is all part of the US presidential election campaign, isn't it? I mean, this is all just in the run-up to the end of this year, is it November, where we have Donald Trump standing for re-election.
And we're in July. Will there be an election? I've asked some of my American guests recently to speculate, because of everything that's happened, because of the virus, which we'll talk about in a moment, and the shutdown globally, Trump, of course, having to deal with that like every other leader of every other country. It occurred to some of my listeners, some of my more learned listeners, that this might be the first, I don't know if it would be the first one to be suspended or delayed in US history. I'd have to look that up, but I think it very well might be if that was the case. Do you still expect it to go ahead?
Yeah, I do. I can't imagine it not. I mean, I'd be very surprised if it isn't. I think, you know, the fact that Biden has been manoeuvred into the position of standing against Trump, you know, the Tweedledum, Tweedledee situation, you know, I don't think they'll cancel their election, because that could cause all sorts of unrest and trouble in the US. Obviously, that may be part of the game, but it's really difficult to know. I don't think they'll cancel the elections. I mean, they've cancelled the elections here, of course, in the UK. Although in many other parts of the world they're going strong, you know, and in France, for example, they've carried on. Many places have just carried on. And we've got, by the way, you know, this is the other backdrop to this whole thing about the statue in Bristol, is we've got Labour Mayor Marvin Rees, who's mixed race, from a West Indian father, who's just got a free year. I mean, basically, he's a dictator for a year. He was supposed to be re-elected in May. Every possibility was going to be booted out because he's been so appalling as a mayor. I mean, I'm slightly biased saying that, you know, having run the politics show in Bristol on the radio every week since he's been mayor. But all the stuff has come back about him basically has been negative. He's effectively a kind of a tool, puppet of the establishment. He's been doing exactly what they want. His latest stream of stuff is basically selling off important bits of public land which could be used for either infrastructure or cultural or shared facilities that the public is open to the public, flogging this land off in secret to speculators. And first thing anyone in Bristol finds out about it, that piece of land is gone. They've got planning permission on it now, have they? And that's the first anyone knows about this land being sold off. So it's not going out for tender in any public way. It's just been sold off down the pub by Marvin Rees to his mates.
Marvin Rees, of course, the first we ever heard of him, of course, Tony, was listening to your programme, but also for many of our listeners because of the statues thing. Local authorities have been demanding, through people like the Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, they've been demanding, I've been covering this the last few days, it's a bit sinister, this. They want people's data, they want their medical data to better effectively trace people, to avoid more localised lockdowns. And in the House of Commons the other day, Matt Hancock effectively told Jonathan Ashworth the local councils are getting that data. They are getting personal identifiable data to help them follow people that have maybe tested positive and been told to stay at home, so that they can follow up on those people. This really is 1984 now, and I don't say that for effect. I don't say it to be dramatic, but I think it's gotten as bad as it's going to get, and then day by day something else happens that isn't challenged, that isn't opposed by any politician really in the country of any note. And I think, where are we going to be next year? Well, we know, of course, that masks will be introduced in shops in the UK, in England, I should say, by next week, by next Friday, tomorrow week. And I fear personally, none of that is going to change until they mass produce a vaccine. And I really believe when that happens, that those of us who don't partake in the vaccine will be told that we will be subject to our own personal lockdown of sorts. In other words, well, that's okay, Mr. Allen, but you'll kind of have to hang around your home, or as near to it as best you can. Am I letting my imagination run away with myself, or am I on the right track? What do you think?
Well, I think you are. You're losing it there. No, actually, of course not. Look, this is definitely a part of, I think, a much more sinister and bigger and deeper plan that's been hanging around for many, many years. I would suggest the most important person to look at with regard to understanding how the elite, the new world, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, the Gates and his friends and his backers, the oligarchy, have been preparing for a pandemic to shock the world, has been looking at the way that Andrew Wakefield's been treated over the years. I mean, I spent at least 3 years literally puzzling, scratching my head. Why is it? Is it just about the money that Andrew Wakefield is being attacked? He's one of the best people as speakers on vaccines, and he's extremely good. He's not one of these people that says, oh, all vaccines are bad. He will say, well, this vaccine is good. It works. And so let's keep it because it's passed the safety tests. It's been tested properly and it works. But don't then start injecting it into young kids when it hasn't been tested on young kids. Don't inject it with 5 other vaccines into a newborn child. What do you think you're doing? And he's making absolutely clear that this is simply not acceptable. This is effectively using young infants who've got no kind of mental capability to make a decision to take these vaccines, multiple vaccines, as guinea pigs. This is Dr. Mengele's experimentation chamber in the concentration camp. This really is literally what they're doing with young kids now with these vaccines, because the amount of people who are being harmed by them is enormous. And so many people, I mean, it's just anecdotally speaking to people who say, oh, yes, well, I had this vaccine and actually I caught whatever it was, the flu, say. Even worse, many people have had serious permanent injuries due to various vaccines. I was looking recently at the swine flu vaccine in the 1970s in the US, which was injected into millions of Americans, and it hadn't been tested at all. And then what happens as people start to get together to sue the vaccine manufacturers in the US in the late 70s and early 80s? So the American pharmaceutical industry gets together and gets a new law passed in the States. I think it was 1983 or 4. Which means they don't have to pay any compensation for any damages that are caused by vaccines that they have made and that they have recommended and injected into people. So the government has to take all the liability. So that means, of course, the government and the courts are deciding on whether people get any compensation if their loved ones die after having a vaccine. So, the government very rarely finds itself guilty. And so the pharmaceutical industry has got a free pass. It's completely controlled the regulation of its own products. And so we can't trust anything they do. Yes, if there are proper tests and if there's proper analysis, fine. But Wakefield's attack, the attack on Wakefield, Richie, over the years, to me has crystallised exactly what was going on. They've been preparing for this vaccine pandemic ID 2020 for decades, and this is their big moment. Whether they decided to do it now because of the attempt to ramp up attacks on China and the potential war on China, or whether it's just in order to destabilise Brexit, I have absolutely no idea. But whatever it is, it's definitely a new world order, deep state, oligarchy's decision to do this. And they don't care whether we live or die. The idea that they want us to wear masks, well, that's just in order to coerce us, as I said before, into ultimately taking this vaccine when it comes down the line, as it definitely will.
Make life very difficult for people, and there might come a point when they might beg for the vaccine. I've got Piers Corbyn coming on the programme in about 15 minutes, the physicist and meteorologist. I don't need to tell you who he is. You know who he is. Let me ask you this question. Is it patently obvious now that even if these are not his ideas, is it patently obvious that Bill Gates is the driving force or the front man behind these agendas? Let me very quickly explain why I'm asking you that. Everybody is running a story today to say that rising temperatures in Siberia and the Arctic are proof that man-made climate change is real. The study is done by the World Weather Attribution Initiative. That organisation, I cannot determine whether or not it gets funding from Gates, but I suspect it does. However, its only major partner is the Oxford University Environmental Change Institute. The woman who heads that up, Monica Zurek, used to work for Gates in terms of agriculture, in managing money to be sent for sustainable agricultural products around the world. So there's a direct link between this and Gates. You look at Gates then, vaccines, depopulation. Gates was in the news yesterday talking about depopulation, the necessity to reduce population growth in coming years. Obviously implantables, Gates is all over that as well. Gates is everywhere. So is Gates basically the captain or the rear admiral of this agenda? If it's a ship, if we see the agenda as a big boat, it's not his idea. There might be people above him, but he seems to be in charge on the ground, right?
Well, no, I don't think he's in charge. He's the front man. He's the guy who's going to be the public face of all of this. He comes across as very affable. Hey, everyone, I want to be everyone's friend, you know. The fact of the matter is he's not, is he? He's the one who's got the back doors for the National Security Agency and IBM and everybody else into all of our Windows machines. And that's how he's made his money, just by sneaking into our lives, by stealing our data, by mining our lives and selling them on. That's Mr. Gates for you. And yes, okay, his Windows system is pretty good. I mean, no, but it comes at a price. Bill Gates' price. The people behind him, I would suggest, are more like your Bilderberger characters. So we're talking about the real oligarchy. That is to say, the people with the power and the wealth, mostly the bankers. There's a whole smattering of aristocracy in there, European aristocracy. There's your characters like Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, has a very, very close ties with China as well as the United States. And people like Kissinger need to be examined much more closely, especially when they start threatening that if you don't get this COVID right, there might be a world war. Well, I mean, is that a threat? Or it's couched in terms of language that makes you think it's a warning. But is it actually a threat? Is he saying, look, you better do as we say, otherwise there's going to be a world war, folks? But anyhow, I mean, this is part of the ID 2020 is very, very simple. Have a good old look at that and you'll see exactly what's going on. The idea is to have an identification card that you carry around, a bit like a credit card with an RFID chip in it that blips as you go in and out of a door, and you can only come in if you've got this, which will show that you have been vaccinated or not. Now, what's going to happen? So what will happen is people who've been vaccinated and don't want to will borrow cards or get fraudulently new cards made for people who have had the vaccination. So they will then be able to go around, but then they'll say, oh gosh, you can't do this. We need to embed these chips in people's bodies because people have been fraudulently walking in, even though they haven't had the vaccine. In which case we start moving into very sinister Revelation territory. This is the mark of the beast.
Book of Revelation,
this is the idea that you cannot buy or sell unless you've got this thing in your forehead or in your hand. And I mean, that immediately smacks of sensible stuff from 2000 or so years ago to me, because you've got two classes, haven't you? You've got the head types. These are the people in charge. And then you've got the hand types. These are the kind of worker bees. And that's, I think, the way they're treating us, Richie, really is like a bunch of idiots fed nonsense and lies through the mass media. And we are basically there to be herded around and mind controlled, told what to think. And then we start getting, if you start getting into the book of Revelation itself, you'll see there are several very distinct sections, and it takes you right the way through a period of years, with the arrival of characters like the Antichrist, etc., who will make an attempt to rule the world, a one world order. But ultimately, the good news is they fail. They just can't get it together. They can't convince the world that they're the nice guys. However many people they kill, they just can't do it. And I don't know quite how it's all going to play out, but it's all there. You know, the seven seals, the seven vials, the seven bowls, and I actually have done a timeline of Revelation. I did it years ago. It must be 15 years ago. I just sat and looked at. And there are lots of little things in there that make you think. Like, for example, it talks about wormwood. Now, wormwood is the Ukrainian for wormwood is Chernobyl. So this suggests that maybe there's a little bit of information in there saying that part of the world is going to be covered with nuclear fallout or some sort of nuclear pollution. And you wouldn't believe that John, the Apostle John, could write that on Patmos, nearly 2,000 years ago, but he did.
Yeah, the more I hear, you've said that to me there, and people have been in touch with me in the last couple of weeks talking about that very thing, the chip and the vaccine and, it being foretold and the coincidences and the similarities. Yeah, I'm not optimistic. We'll finish up on this. I'll give you the final word. I think whatever the agenda, whatever the forces are behind it, I think they've been extraordinarily successful in recent years in distancing people from one another through the many things we've talked about over the years, identity politics, of course, race wars, cultural wars, to the point where even in traditional working class communities where people would have been throughout history would have known the names of their neighbours and would have interacted on a daily basis with their neighbours. I see it now even in Salford. People just don't give a shit, Tony. And that's what makes it all the easier for them to succeed with this. I see this succeeding. I don't believe time is linear anyway. I think we've been through this a million times, and maybe we'll go through it a million times again. We're not going to win this. Whatever they want to do, they're going to do it, because I just see people effectively begging for it, and I see other people just resign to it.
Well, look, I'm going to shine a little bit of light in this conversation.
Go on, son.
I totally disagree with you. Look, what I've seen, for example, we had a demonstration on Sunday in Thornbury, just north of Bristol, which was attended by 100 or so people, even though there was no publicity for it at all. The press never attend. Of course they don't. It was an anti-lockdown protest, and there were a whole load of speakers there talking about everything. It was organised by a young mum in a tower block, not by some sort of civil society organisation. There are people all over the place who are absolutely onto this. People I chat to down the street, or the other thing is that a lot of people are not prepared to talk about it with strangers. If it's somebody that they know, they trust, they will. I was chatting to someone I'd known for a few years the other day who was saying that he works for KPMG. And he's extremely worried about all this because he knows that he's going to have this vaccine. But he's looking at ways of making it so that he can not have the vaccine and yet have some sort of certificate to say he has had the vaccine. And he's also having to say the complete opposite at work about what he really believes, so that he isn't flagged up as somebody who's going to be an anti-vaxxer. It's a very, very complicated issue, and lots of people are not, and particularly in the Brits are quite good at this, actually. They're not telling you to your face what they really think about it all. So there's definitely an awareness raising going on, particularly, I'd say, in places like council estates. We found exactly the same with 9/11, by the way, that loads of people living on council estates have seen all this stuff. They've seen this. I would imagine many of them have seen this head of the snake thing, for example, about Ghislaine Maxwell. There are various other things that everything to do with this pandemic. They're seeing lots of their people losing their jobs. They're saying, this is just the Tories up to their usual tricks. So I think, and also if you look at what the Bible says about this, okay, now I realise a lot of your listeners won't think that this is, a good template for what's going to happen and what's happening. But, it's all contested, Richie, right the way down the way. It's definitely not a walkover. You get the Antichrist and the false prophet on one side. on the devil's side, trying to enslave humanity. And then you get the two witnesses on God's side who are constantly out there saying, no, they're talking rubbish, they're talking nonsense and arguing the other case. So, this is the way the Bible talks about it. And it also makes it very clear that there will be a big military contest here. So it's not just about, a discussion in the media. The revolution will not be televised. It's also, a very big battle out there in the world. And ultimately, they lose. Be sure they cannot crush the human spirit. They do everything they possibly can to do it, but my God, they end up landing flat on their face.
I'm not going to answer that, T. I think my audience needed to hear that. They've enough of my miserable, pessimistic predictions. Thanks for coming back on today. Thisweek.org.uk.
What I will do, Richie, sorry, before we finish, is I'll just tweet after the show. I'll tweet a link to my Revelation timeline.
Do you know, Tony, you took the words out of my mouth. I was just going to say that. You did that before we met. We met during my days in Spain back around 2009. So I think you put that together before that. And hey, let's make time to discuss that particular subject on its own because there's so much in it. And I know
the sun gets invariably hot. Revelation 16:8. The earth turns completely dark, 16:10. So that's the bit that I think you've been dwelling too much upon.
Yeah, maybe. Listen, mate, Bilderberg.org, thisweek.org.uk. Follow Tony on Twitter. There's only one Tony Gosling on Twitter, so if you look for Tony Gosling, you'll find him. Follow him there. He tweets daily. He's always got interesting things to say. Thanks for your time, my friend. Love having you on.
God bless you, Richie. Cheers.
You too, and mind the ankle. Cheers, T. A bit of a sprained ankle, Tony Gosling, he's dealing with there, and came on to talk to us despite that. 6.5 minutes past the hour. This is the Richie Allen radio show for Thursday, July 15th. Is it, or is it the 16th? 16th.